Hello, I'm Linda Post Bushkofsky, Executive Director of Women of the ELCA. I'm standing in the nave at United Lutheran Church in Oak Park, Illinois, where my husband serves as pastor. We live next door in the parsonage, but I thought that these beautiful stained glass windows might make a better backdrop for my presentation today than my home office might. For the benefit of those who might be watching this in the future, I am recording this in September of 2020. While I have offered many keynote addresses in the past as executive director these last 18 years, this marks a first for me. I have never recorded a keynote address in an empty nave with no other people present. But then we've all been called to do new and different things since COVID-19 entered our world earlier this year, haven't we? Normally, I feed off the energy in the audience, responding to the women as they respond to me. So there's not going to be any of that today. What I think I'll try to do is envision an invigorating crowd of Lutheran women here in the nave with me, hanging on every word I say. Let's see how that works. Hats off to the Metro Chicago Synodical Women's Organization for trying something new with this virtual event. And hats off to many of the other synodical organizations that are doing the same thing in this new age we find ourselves in. Your event planners have chosen the theme, Women, Finding Our Voices. And they note that 100 years ago, women won the right to vote in the United States, and that 50 years ago, North American Lutherans ordained the first woman. Both of these are events when women's voices were heard in new and different ways. There is a challenge, however, in marking such anniversaries that offer an incomplete narrative, celebrations which might ignore the complicated legacy and reality of these events. It's true that this year we mark 100 years since the landmark ratification and adoption of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It bars states from considering a voter's sex in determining their eligibility to vote. Unfortunately, that amendment did not guarantee all women the right to vote. Even though women of color fought side by side in the suffrage movement in the 19th century and the early 20th century with their white sisters, the suffrage movement fell short for women of color. It wasn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that women of color truly got the right to vote in the United States. One commentator has said it this way: this dichotomy of professing a commitment to equality while embracing the privileges of exclusion was not unique to the debate about women's suffrage. It reflects a larger reality that while women have made important gains, these gains have not always been evenly experienced. In 2020, we also observed the 50th anniversary since the first woman in the North American Lutheran tradition was ordained. It took the institutional church a very long time to catch up with the reality that existed in the first and second century of the fledgling Christian church when women occupied every office of leadership. This year, however, we also observed that it was 40 years ago, not 50, when the first African American woman was ordained in our tradition. And it's only been 10 years since LGBTQIA+ individuals have been able to freely serve. We must keep all of this in mind as we mark these anniversaries. There are so many ways to explore the theme of finding our voices. I'll start by telling a little bit about my story, hoping that within it you'll hear a little bit about your own story. For some reason unknown to me, I never had to find my voice. I always knew I had a voice and I used it. Even as a young girl, I had opinions and convictions, and I simply stated them. I didn't know any different. Perhaps it was the encouragement of my parents, or maybe my place in the family birth order. Maybe it's just a quirk of my personality. Who knows? I didn't need to find my voice. If anything, I had to learn how and when to use my voice, and how and when to help others find and use their voices. I learned at a young age that those who control communication vehicles have some measure of influence in having their words be heard. I was editor of my high school newspaper. I didn't take too many editorial stances of note back in high school, but I did when I became the editor of my college newspaper. I wrote about national issues of importance in the late 1970s and early 1980s, like whether women should be included in the draft or whether the Equal Rights Amendment should be ratified. I also wrote about local issues, like the quality of health care in our student health clinic or the treatment of animals in the university's psychology lab. I've continued that practice of using communication tools, and many years later, as I became executive director of Women of the ELCA, I have a platform every month in Gather magazine with every issue where I can share my hopes, my concerns, encouragements. I also write regularly for our blog at welca.org/blog for those very same reasons. I also learned to take and look for opportunities that came up where I could voice my opinion in my everyday life, whether it was Girl Scouts or church or school. I always accepted invitations to speak. And sometimes when an invitation was not forthcoming, I would speak anyway. As an attorney and then as a church leader, I've had many opportunities to use my voice, both to seek to empower other women's voices and also to address issues of injustice myself. Well, you might ask, why do I use my voice? It is part of what I am called to do as a Christian. If you look to the commitments that we make at the affirmation of our baptism, you'll find our marching orders. Grab a copy of the Evangelical Lutheran Worship if you have it, and take a look at page 236. There you'll see the language that we use in making our commitment. We commit to continue in the covenant God made with us in holy baptism, and then there's a list of ways that we do that, including proclaiming the good news of God in Christ through word and deed, and striving for justice and peace in all the earth. I must use my voice to live out my baptismal calling. You must use your voice too. And we don't have to do it in the same way. Some of us are loud and brash when we use our voices. Some of us are quiet and persistent. But what we must do is use our voices. That's a little bit of my story. Maybe you saw a bit of yourself in there too. There are so many women in our collective past who can serve as role models for us, and they can help inspire us now here in 2020. Think of Mary, Jesus' mother. She used her voice to praise God and to sing of the commonwealth that God is ushering in, where the proud are brought down and the lowly are lifted up, where the hungry are filled with good things, and the rich are sent away empty. How about Anna, the prophet? She was 84 years old, and she got to meet the baby Jesus when Jesus was brought for presentation at the temple. Luke records that encounter and says, Anna began speaking about the child to all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. That's quite an audience she was speaking to. Then there's the Canaanite woman who asked Jesus to help her demon-possessed and tormented daughter. She used her voice to seek the help for another. And how about the Samaritan woman at the well who encountered Jesus in the noonday heat? Well, she used her voice as the first evangelist, telling others about Jesus and what he had said and done. There are many, many women in our historical past, women like Hildegard of Bingen, Katharina von Bora-Luther, Anne Hutchinson, Anne Franklin, Harriet Tubman, Victoria Woodhull, Sojourner Truth, Jeanette Rankin, Jane Addams. Our history is filled with women who found their voices, sometimes by trial and error, but they found their voices so they could speak out for universal suffrage, for the care of those who were living in poverty, for peace and not for war, so that they could speak out against racism, against sexism, against all manner of inequities. There are lots of contemporary women and girls who serve as role models and inspire us too. How about Greta Tunberg? She found her voice and uses it to bring worldwide attention to climate change issues. There's Malala Yousafzai, a recent Oxford University graduate and not to mention a Nobel Peace Prize winner, who found her voice bringing global attention to educating girls. Malala has said, "I tell my story not because it is unique, but because it is the story of many girls." How about Lema Bowie, our Lutheran sister, who used her voice to bring an end to civil war in Liberia, who used her voice to invite other Christian women and Muslim women to use their voices, to empower them, to amplify their voices so that they could bring about peace in their homeland. I can't help but mention Ruth Bader Ginsburg, attorney, legal scholar, U.S. Supreme Court judge, who died last Friday. For decades, Justice Ginsburg used her voice to speak for equality. Now, you and I are not likely to become Nobel Peace Prize winners or to garner a worldwide stage in the ways that Greta and Malala and Lema and Ruth have done. But that's not any excuse for not finding and using our own voices where we live and are. The reality is that society has told us for far too long to be quiet and simply blend in as women. Carolyn Lewis, who's a professor at Luther Seminary, has made this statement: "We have been socialized systemically to distrust our voice, to apologize for our voice, to not speak out and speak up. These are ways in which women's voices have been routinely silenced." Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest woman in the U.S. Congress, has put it this way: "The reason women are critiqued for being too loud or too meek, too big or too small, too smart to be attractive or too attractive to be smart, is to belittle women out of standing up publicly. The goal is to critique into submission, and that applies to anyone challenging power." If anyone among us knows what it's like to be critiqued, it's AOC, don't you think? I have found it inspiring to hear her on the floor of the U.S. House, speaking from her convictions as a Christian and her understanding of what her faith calls her to do and say. Well, I think we all know what can happen when a woman does use her voice and speaks out. She can quickly be described as a nasty woman. Well, who cares? I say wear that description proudly. Why do we need to find and use our voices? Well, first and foremost, as Christian women, we find and use our voices because it is one way in which we live out our baptismal promises. It is not optional. It's what we do as Christians. As author Kathy Kong has said, our voice is meant to be and bring good news. In using our voices now, our global sisters are encouraged to find and use their voices too. In using our voices now, the next generation is encouraged to use their voices too. And when we use our voices now, it helps other women around us use their voices too. Lawyer and human rights activist Amal Clooney says it this way: the worst thing we can do as women is not stand up for each other. She echoes the words of Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State. There's a special place in hell for women who do not help each other. Find your voice, find your style, find your passion, speak your mind. What happens when you don't find your voice and you don't use it? You don't join in the conversation, obviously. You're not part of the solution. What is uniquely you, your thoughts and your feelings, are not contributed to the greater good. Sisters, it's time to stop playing it safe. You need to find, claim, and own your voice now. Don't imitate others. Be authentically you. Have courage to speak. Start by practicing in places and settings where the risk is low. Then grow over time into other settings. Look to other women for support. And please, support other women as they are on this journey with you. We must stand up for each other. You've probably seen a t-shirt or a meme with these words. When hate is loud, love cannot be silent. There's a lot of hate in our world today. I don't have to tell you that. Hate that is gender-based, hate that is race-based, hate that is politically based, hate that's even based in religion. And all that hate is loud, incredibly loud. When hate is loud, love cannot be silent. You and I cannot be silent. We are called to be and bring the good news. You and I and our voices have been called for such a time as this.